Here's a long story based on your request. Boy with Tourette's. Humiliated by boss jewelry Japan. Unconscious Keanu Reeves looking ahead angry. The neon lights of Tokyo cast a cold glow over the bustling streets. Rain drizzled softly, reflecting the flickering advertisements on the wet pavement. Inside a high-end jewelry store in the Ginza district, a tense silence lingered, interrupted only by the ticking of an ornate grandfather clock. Keanu Reeves stood near the glass display, his sharp eyes fixed on a scene that made his blood boil. A young employee no older than 20 was trembling as his boss towered over him, his voice dripping with venom. "You're an embarrassment. I told you to polish the sapphire display and you left streaks all over it," the store owner, Mr. Tanaka, barked. His words sliced through the air, cruel and unforgiving. The boy, Hiroshi, struggled to hold back his tics. His Tourette syndrome made his hands twitch, and in moments of stress it worsened. The more he tried to stay still, the worse it got. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean," Hiroshi stammered, his throat tightening. His hand jerked involuntarily, knocking over a tray of rings. The delicate platinum bands scattered across the floor. Tanaka's face twisted in rage. "You clumsy little fool," he spat. "Do you know how much those cost? Maybe if you weren't so defective, you could actually do something right." Keanu's fingers clenched into fists. The room seemed to darken around him, and his breath became slow and controlled, though his jaw tightened. He had seen injustice in many forms, but this was something else. He stepped forward, his boots clicking against the polished floor. The employees froze. Even Tanaka, so absorbed in his cruelty, hesitated when he noticed the tall figure approaching. "Excuse me," Keanu said, his voice eerily calm. "What did you just call him?" Tanaka narrowed his eyes. "This is none of your business," he snapped. "This is my store and I don't need some foreigner interfering in." Before he could finish, Keanu moved. Not with violence, not yet. But the energy in the room shifted as he grabbed the nearest chair and set it down, slowly and deliberately, right between Tanaka and Hiroshi. Then he sat. The silence that followed was suffocating. "You don't get to humiliate people like that," Keanu said, his voice quiet but sharp. "Not in front of me." Tanaka scoffed, but something about Keanu's presence made his confidence falter. "I don't have time for this," he muttered. Keanu leaned forward slightly. "Make time," he said. Hiroshi looked down, his hands shaking, ashamed of himself. He knew who Keanu Reeves was, everyone did, but why was he here? Why was he defending him? "You think you can just insult people because they're different?" Keanu asked. His dark eyes locked onto Tanaka's. "You think that makes you powerful?" Tanaka exhaled sharply. "The boy is incompetent," he argued. "He should know his place." Keanu's expression darkened. He reached into his coat and pulled out a sleek black wallet. Without breaking eye contact, he placed a platinum card onto the counter. "I want to buy this store," he said. The air was sucked out of the room. Tanaka's jaw dropped. The other employees gasped. Even Hiroshi's tics seemed to freeze. "W what?" Tanaka stuttered. "You heard me," Keanu said, his tone unchanged. "You don't deserve to run this place. Name your price." Tanaka swallowed hard, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. This isn't for sale," he blurted. Keanu tilted his head. "Then I'll make you an offer you can't refuse," he said, his voice growing colder. "Enough money to retire forever, but on one condition." He turned to Hiroshi. "He stays and you leave." Hiroshi's breath hitched. Tanaka's face twisted in frustration, but the numbers were running in his head. The man in front of him wasn't bluffing. Minutes passed. Then, with a trembling hand, Tanaka picked up the card. "Fine," he spat, defeated. "Take the damn store." Keanu stood, adjusting his coat. He turned to Hiroshi and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "This is yours now," he said softly. "No more cruelty, no more humiliation." Hiroshi's eyes burned with tears. He had never felt seen like this before. As Tanaka stormed out of the store, the employees looked at Keanu in awe. "Are you really keeping the store?" one of them asked. Keanu smirked. "Nah," he said, turning to Hiroshi. "It's yours. Just promise me one thing." Hiroshi wiped his eyes. "Anything. Run it with kindness." And with that, Keanu walked out into the Tokyo night, his mission complete. As Keanu Reeves stepped out of the jewelry store, the neon-lit streets of Tokyo shimmered under the soft drizzle. His breath came out in slow, steady waves as he processed what had just happened. He wasn't one to get involved in personal matters, But something about Hiroshi's humiliation had struck a nerve deep inside him. Maybe it was because he had seen too much cruelty in his lifetime. Maybe it was because he knew what it felt like to be underestimated, dismissed, and misunderstood. His phone buzzed, a message from his manager. "Keanu, where are you? You have interviews tomorrow morning?" He sighed. Hollywood could wait. There were more important things to handle right now. He turned back toward the jewelry store, glancing through the large glass window. Inside, Hiroshi was still standing in shock, his hands pressed against the counter as the other employees murmured in disbelief. A few of them gathered around him, congratulating him, but he still looked lost, as if his mind couldn't fully grasp what had just happened. Keanu smiled faintly. The kid's got hot. Before he could leave, Hiroshi suddenly ran out of the store, his footsteps splashing against the wet pavement. "Mr. Reeves," he called breathlessly. Keanu stopped and turned. "Yeah?" Hiroshi bowed deeply, his entire body trembling, not from tics this time, but from emotion. "I don't know what to say. I don't deserve this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Keanu placed a firm hand on the young man's shoulder. "Of course you do," he said. "You were working hard. He was the one who didn't deserve to be in charge." Hiroshi swallowed hard, looking at the ground. "But I don't know how to run a store. I'm just a part-time worker." Keanu thought for a moment, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a card. He handed it to Hiroshi. "Call this number tomorrow. His name is Kenji Sato. He's a business consultant, one of the best in Japan. He'll teach you everything you need to know." Hiroshi took the card with both hands, his fingers shaking. "Why are you doing this for me?" Keanu exhaled, his expression unreadable. "Because someone once did the same for me," he said. Hiroshi looked up, confused, but Keanu only smiled, patted his shoulder one last time, and started walking away. But fate wasn't done with him yet. Just as he turned a corner, a black sedan with tinted windows screeched to a halt in front of him. The car door flew open, and before Keanu could react, a group of masked men rushed out. A sharp pain exploded at the back of his head, the city lights blurred, his knees buckled. Then darkness. Keanu's mind swam in murky confusion. There were voices, muffled, distant. His body felt heavy, his arms tied behind his back. He could feel the cold metal of a chair against his back. Slowly, his eyes fluttered open. A dimly lit warehouse, concrete floors, the sound of dripping water. A man in a black suit stood in front of him, arms crossed. His face was sharp, aged, and cruel. "You've been causing quite a stir, Mr. Reeves," the man said, his voice eerily calm. "Buying out businesses, helping nobodies, meddling in things you shouldn't." Keanu's head throbbed, but he smirked despite it. "And who the hell are you?" The man smiled thinly. "You can call me Mr. Kubo, and let's just say, I don't appreciate what you did to Tanaka." Keanu's jaw tightened. "So you're his friend?" Kubo let out a low chuckle. "No, I'm his boss." Keanu's mind raced. Yakuza. He had seen men like this before. Cold, powerful, ruthless. "You see," Kubo continued, circling him, "Tanaka was one of my investments. That store was a front, a very profitable one. And now, thanks to you, it's no longer under my control." Keanu exhaled sharply through his nose. "You should be thanking me. That guy was a terrible businessman." Kubo's smile faded. He stepped closer, leaning in. "You may be a Hollywood star, but here in Tokyo you're just another man. And men can disappear." Keanu didn't flinch. He held Kubo's gaze, his anger simmering beneath his calm exterior. "You made one mistake," he said quietly. Kubo raised an eyebrow. "Oh, and what's that?" Keanu's lips curled into a dangerous smirk. "You didn't tie my legs." Before Kubo could react, Keanu launched his foot forward with brutal force. His boot connected with Kubo's knee, a sickening crack echoing through the warehouse. Kubo screamed, stumbling backward. Keanu twisted his body and slammed his chair against the ground, splintering the wood and snapping the ropes around his wrists. He rolled forward, grabbing a broken chair leg, and spun to his feet in one fluid motion. The other men in the warehouse scrambled, reaching for weapons. Keanu cracked his neck. Now, it was personal. Tokyo's silent war. The city never truly slept. Even now, as the streets shimmered under the glow of neon lights and scattered rain, danger lurked beneath its surface. Keanu Reeves stood outside the shattered jewelry store, hands in his coat pockets, eyes scanning the shadows. Hiroshi, still shaken, swept broken glass into a pile near the counter. You should get some rest, Keanu said, his voice calm but firm. Hiroshi shook his head. How can I? They'll just keep coming. Keanu nodded slowly. The kid was right. This wasn't over. The men who attacked the store were just a warning. The real storm was still gathering. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number. It rang twice before a voice answered. Keanu, it's been a while. Kenji, Keanu said, keeping his voice low, I need a favor. The call for backup. Kenji Sato had been many things in his life, business consultant, strategist, and once upon a time, an operative in Japan's underground intelligence network. He had left that life behind, mostly. But when Keanu Reeves called, it wasn't for small talk. By morning, Kenji arrived at the store, dressed in a sharp navy suit, his expression unreadable. He took one glance at the damage and exhaled sharply. You really know how to stir things up, don't you? Kenji muttered. Keanu gave a slight smirk. Just trying to help a friend. Kenji glanced at Hiroshi, who stood uncertainly behind the counter. You must be the kid. Hiroshi nodded. I didn't ask for any of this. Kenji studied him for a moment, then looked back at Keanu. You're not telling me everything. Keanu's face remained unreadable. There's a group behind this. Kubo was just a pawn. Someone bigger is pulling the strings. Kenji sighed. And you want to take them on? Keanu didn't hesitate. Yes. Kenji rubbed his temples. You know this isn't a movie, right? This is real. If you go after them, they will retaliate. Keanu's gaze darkened. Then we make sure we're ready. Kenji looked between Keanu and Hiroshi, then sighed. All right, but if we're doing this, we'd do it smart. The plan. By nightfall, the store had been reinforced, new locks, security cameras, and a discreet alarm system. But Kenji knew that wouldn't be enough. They won't come at you the same way twice, Kenji warned. They'll change tactics. Keanu nodded. Which is why we need to get ahead of them. Kenji smirked. I know a guy. He might have information on who's really behind this. Hiroshi, still nervous but determined, clenched his fists. What can I do? Kenji looked at him seriously. Learn. This isn't just about keeping your store. It's about knowing how to survive in a world where power controls everything. Hiroshi straightened his back. Then teach me. Keanu placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. We will. As the city lights flickered in the distance, the three men stood together, preparing for what was to come. The real fight hadn't started yet, but when it did, they would be ready. Should we dive deeper into the mystery? Shadows of Tokyo, the night air carried the hum of distant traffic. But here, in the back alleys of Shinjuku, silence ruled. Keanu Reeves, Kenji Sato, and Hiroshi stood near a dimly lit ramen shop, waiting. He's late, Hiroshi muttered, shifting uncomfortably. He'll come, Kenji said. His tone was calm, but his eyes scanned the street with the sharpness of someone who had lived in Tokyo's underworld for too long. Keanu remained still, hands in his pockets. His instincts told him that tonight was going to change everything. Then, from the shadows, a man approached. He was old, with silver hair slicked back and deep lines carved into his face. He wore a long coat, his steps deliberate. Kenji, the man greeted, his voice low. Takeda, Kenji replied. We need information. Takeda's gaze flickered to Keanu. I know who you are, and I know why you're here. Keanu nodded. Then you know what I want. Takeda sighed. You're looking for the one who controlled Kubo. But what you don't realize is, you've already stepped into something much bigger than you think. Hiroshi frowned. What do you mean? Takeda leaned in slightly. Kubo was a middleman. The real power behind him is a faction known as Shirogane Kai, an old network, deeply embedded in the city's businesses, politics, and law enforcement. They don't operate like street thugs, they move quietly from the shadows. Kenji's face darkened. I've heard rumors about them. Takeda nodded. They won't forget what happened at the warehouse, and they won't stop until they've made an example of you. Keanu exhaled. Let them try. Takeda studied him for a long moment. You're bold, Reeves, but this isn't a movie. There are no stunt doubles here. Keanu's expression didn't change. I know. Takeda smirked slightly. In that case, you'll need allies, people who know how to fight this kind of war. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small slip of paper. A single name was written on it. Find this man. If anyone can help you, it's him. Keanu took the paper and glanced at it. A single word stood out. Hayato. Takeda stepped back into the shadows. Be careful, Reeves. The deeper you go, the harder it is to return. And just like that, he was gone. The hunt begins. Back at the jewelry store, Hiroshi sat at the counter, turning the name over in his mind. Who is Hayato? He finally asked. Kenji leaned against the wall. If it's the same Hayato I think it is, he's a former enforcer, used to work for one of the most powerful families in Tokyo. Then he disappeared. Keanu stared at the name, then folded the paper. Then we find him. Kenji crossed his arms. And if he doesn't want to be found, Keanu smirked, then we give him a reason. Hiroshi swallowed hard. And what about Shirogane Kai? Keanu's smirk faded. His gaze turned to the night outside, where Tokyo gleamed like a city of ghosts. They'll come for us, he said. But we won't be the ones running. As the rain began to fall once more, the three men knew this was only the beginning. Should we take the search for Hayato deeper?